As we jump into today's program, the U.S. government has proposed a rule that would require electric identification for certain animals. This has been a hot button topic among producers for the past couple of decades now, but USDA officials and others say the EID tags are needed for disease tracking. UNL's Elliott stopped by the Market Journal studio this week to discuss the latest when it comes to the traceability proposal. To set this up for us, what's the framework of this conversation?
Yeah, really. So this started really back in 2004 when we had mad cow disease and really limited our ability to export protein products nationwide. Even though we resolved that issue and fairly quickly, we still started to feel those effects. Even as recent as 2019 when we officially got the last kind of export restriction taken off from the US. So issued 2004, last impacts in 2019, pretty substantial market impact. And so this is just a larger conversation that's been really happening since that of how do we develop an animal identification system that allows us to identify the problem animals, isolate them, with minimizing the impact on the overall industry.
So most commonly, this is coming in the form of an ear tag that goes on an animal. What have been some of the framework coming out from USDA about how this would work?
Back in 2013, the USDA Animal Health Plant Inspection Service really started to try to develop some rulemaking behind this. And it started with saying, anytime there's interstate commerce, we need to make sure that they're transferring some sort of veterinary record. And then in 2018, they said, well, what type of, we need to make sure it's electronic so we don't have errors in the database. And that really led to this idea of we need to have electronic ear tags. That was really required to be implemented in 2022. They started to hand out free ear tags to do this. And really this current phase of this rulemaking just clarified some of the issues that producers had made in the comment period about what is a dairy cattle, is it EID or specific to RFID? So it just provided some greater clarification, really.
Where are we at timeline-wise of this rollout and what kind of animals are going to be impacted?
Yep, so this federal register came out in the middle of January, and so we have 6 months or 180 days from there before it to be implemented. It does have a notice and comment period, which means producers or anyone in the public are allowed to submit comments, which the federal government has to address each comment before it can be officially implemented. So if you have questions or concerns, always submit your comments. They will be addressed. And really this represents a relatively smaller portion of the industry. So this is all interstate transfer of cattle that are over 18 months of age and not intended for slaughter. So you start to put all of those bounds that really is affecting, breeding animals that are, crossing interstate lines. That'd be, bred cows and bulls. So anything 18 months or less, which is the typical feeder cattle that's transferring, that wouldn't be. Cull cows intended for slaughter, that wouldn't be there. And so those are the types of animals that would be required to have the electronic identification. And the big benefit is if you already have metal tags in place in the animals, you're not required to re-implement those. Those are good, basically grandfathered in from currently to the end of the life of the animal.
You were sharing with me that the U.S. is pretty far behind when we look across the world at folks implementing electronic identification, right?
Yeah, so when we look at where we're at as far as the U.S. compared to, let's say, the major beef exporting in development countries, Brazil, Australia, Argentina, all of them have at least some form of either mandatory identification on their animals. So the example that we're talking about is, Brazil has an FMD outbreak in a certain region. They're able to isolate that. We've eliminated the problem animals. We've FMD vaccinated free, and we're allowed to continue to import that beef. That's a huge benefit. Without an identification system, which we don't really have any, we would essentially be subject to a national ban. Whereas if we have these state level and we can isolate it, we're able to say, yes, we've identified the animal, it's within this certain region, and we can continue to export animals outside that region. Classic example is with the bird flu that just happened this past year. We were able to identify the farms in which it was there, we contained it, and then all the other bird populations were not affected.
I think one of the most common concerns we hear from the industry as this is being rolled out is, what about the data? Where's the data going? And you were sharing with me it's not necessarily stored by the USDA, it just has to be accessed by folks there, right?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the use of all the data we're collecting, the number one issue that the USDA says is what's the accuracy? Who is responsible for the accuracy? And currently under the rule, it would be required that the veterinary who's distributing the ear tags is required to store that information for at least 5 years. And so that data is there. The veterinary service agency is required to manage that, make sure it's in compliance with the USDA policies, whether that's their own record keeping or they are providing a free service for producers to use or for vets to use. And so the USDA should just be able to access that information if there is an event and really be able to verify and implement their national protocol. So it's not storing the database and then being punitive in action. It's more we need to have access to the data when we need it so that we can implement the protocols and really preserve the marketability of products both domestically and internationally.